Hello, everyone, and welcome back, Neil. Such an honor
Thank you,
and joy.
Doru. Yeah.
Our previous conversation was quite exciting. It got already a lot of hits. In other
Good.
words, people are watching, people are listening, hopefully, people are learning. And I think this present conversation flows naturally from the previous one. Because towards the end of our earlier chat, somehow we got to discussing matters of providence and if there's any room for let's call it theological reconsideration of the topic of providence within our own circumstances.
Answers,
We have so many challenges these days.
Oh, yes.
Climate change finally is acknowledged by more and more voices, perhaps not in Australia and the United States, but anyway, there's the evidence stares us in the face. Whatever we had, in previous decades, something like a catastrophe per decade or something seems to be an annual event, if not more than once repeated every year. We are in the second year of the pandemic. And one of the things that I noticed looking, cursorily here, there, everywhere, is some kind of polarization of opinions. On the one hand, there's this governmental, optimistic, positivist narrative. Science will sort things out for us. It's just a matter of taking the jab, making the vaccine, which is fine.
Yeah.
I know you are fully vaccinated.
Absolutely.
I'm almost there. So I'm halfway through. So that's not the problem. But there's, on the one hand, this optimistic view. Science will sort things out, which might be the case. On the other hand, there's the view of many believers that turn to their faith and somehow, with a twisted sense of the divine providence, challenge everything, including common sense, because providence will sort things out for them. So we have this situation of a polarized society, polarized views, including within the churches across the spectrum, overconfidence on both sides, whether we speak of science or we speak of faith. And I believe that the topic that interests both of us, providence, if well treated, and the topic of providence well understood, might give us a better, sounder idea of how things look like or should look like, at least from the viewpoint of people of faith. Back to you.
Look, my interest in the whole question of providence probably goes back to when I was teaching topics on grace and sin, original sin, all that sort of stuff. And it became clear the whole question of the interaction of grace, freedom, sinfulness, how we can understand that theologically was impossible to resolve without a strong attention to the theme of providence and what it means for God to be creator. So the starting point of any understanding of divine providence is in God being the creator of everything that is. So that sort of drove me to sort of go back mainly to the sort of work of Thomas Aquinas and other classical sources to try and see how they maintain this balance of God's creative activity, human freedom, and the reality of sinfulness in the world. Because when you properly understand what it means for God to be creator, transcendent creator, the that who is outside space and time, whose act of creation is a single act, not a serialization of acts, but a single act, which encompasses the totality of creation, from the beginning of creation to whatever it means for creation to come to an end. Once you understand that sort of comprehensive, unified singleness of the creative act of God, the problem becomes then, what is God not responsible for in some way? It's on the other hand, saying God wills something becomes simply, well, it happened. Does God will suffering? Well, suffering happens. Suffering is part of the human condition. What God doesn't will is evil, sin. So there was a whole sort of trying to find this sort of balancing point of maintaining both human freedom, the sovereignty of God's willing, and the problem of evil. And I could see that, you go one way and you fall into this set of problems. You go the other way, you fall into a different set of problems. And just trying to find that almost unique point, the fulcrum point on which these could all be held together. And I think Aquinas does a pretty good job of that. I mean, I think he's pretty insightful in the way in which he does it. But one of the things that emerges out of that is a very strong doctrine of providence, the providential ordering of creation doesn't exclude, there is an ordering, but it's an ordering which includes aspects which we find difficult and tough. There's God, all we in a sense, all we can hope for in it's actually the notion of providence is a hope-filled doctrine, in that in the end we know that this creation, with all its difficulties, has been willed by God, is maintained, and reaches its culmination in God. So there's a hope there, and that God's will reach what God wills, that we will come to the point of whatever it is that God wills for us.
In a way, this is a matter of saying something like creation already entails salvation, and it's happy, blessed final outcome.
Yeah, and not without. I mean, it's not without struggles, and it's not without breakdowns, and it's not without all the things that we encounter, and it's not without evil. We certainly know that there's a lot of just mendacity and bad will and all that sort of stuff. We have no shortage of that, and that's the only thing that God doesn't will, in a sense, that God may allow people to sin, but he doesn't will it to be. I've written at various times that not even God understands why we sin, because there's something fundamentally unintelligible about it. I remember, when, of course, we're right on the anniversary now of September 11, the greatest, perhaps terrorist act that we've ever seen, in terms of its impact, at least. And, people were asking, why did they do this? And there's a sense in which that question has no answer. Like, there is no reason which is proportionate to the outcome. There is no reason which could justify doing this act. So they may have various excuses and rationalizations, but there is no reason proportionate to flying 2 planes into buildings and killing everyone in the planes and the people who couldn't get out of the buildings and the collapse of the buildings and so on. There's a fundamental unintelligibility about evil which resists anyone's ability to understand it, including God's. But everything else comes out of a divine intelligence and love, which can turn around evil into something good. I mean, I always think I love the never-ending story. You probably remember that story, probably. And they picture evil as a nothing.
Yep.
A void. It is a void. It's a void of meaning. And there's a meaninglessness about evil. And the way to deal with the problem of evil is not to try and destroy it because it's not there. The way to overcome evil is to create something out of nothing. It's like the original act of creation. It's to find meaning, to draw meaning, to create meaning out of the meaninglessness of evil, to create new meaning. So to find ways of, building something good, something rich, something new out of that, which wasn't there before.
And I assume that from the viewpoint of God, sorry to interrupt you, Neil. From the viewpoint of God, yes, you can speak of creation or recreation, creation anew, which transforms evil into something, or at least it gives it a chance to become something better. But from our end, would this be equivalent to what we call very generally conversion?
It can be conversion. Yeah, I mean, it is a turning around of that. I mean, we see it in the way. I always think the South African situation, apartheid, which was a great evil, and when that was overthrown, I mean, I think a lot of us were very, very anxious that this could descend into revenge, bloodletting, just turning into complete chaos. But they established this sort of truth and reconciliation process, and it was a creative response. It was we don't require people to say they're sorry. We just require them to tell the truth. And it achieved what I think a lot of people did not think would be possible. Now, obviously it's not, there's still problems there. It's not perfect or anything like that, but it was a way of releasing some of that, turning around some of that evil into a potential good.
I see. Yeah.
And not everyone got what they wanted out of it, but it did serve its purpose, I think. So we see the same with the Me Too movement, where the evil of sexual assault is now being turned around by people's willingness to say no, the people's willingness to suffer the shame of being a sexual assault victim and being public about it and saying, look, the shame is not mine. The shame is the perpetrators. So all that is, I liken it to creation out of nothing. It's the creation ex nihilo, which is a sure sign that God is acting, because only God can create something out of nothing. And when we turn around situations by people's willingness to stand up to evil and take the suffering of that and turn it into something new, so that the suffering becomes a giving birth to something, not just a destructive suffering, but a giving birth to this new thing, which is a good thing. So that's, I mean, all that was sort of apropos of questions about providence, because this is the the large providential picture, which, or, a universe that we live in, which includes a lot of suffering, a lot of, what used to be called natural evil. I don't like that term. I just think it's fine. It's finitude.
I never use it.
Yeah,
I don't
it's
believe
finitude.
in natural evil.
Yeah, we're finite beings. We're finite beings, and we do get sick and we do get old, and death is inescapable in the end, in whichever way it might come. So it's not. It's always a question of how we meet these challenges. And God's not going to, pull the magic rabbit out of the hat and turn and protect people. I think there's, and I've said this again often enough, for a lot of people, religion is a talisman that they have to protect them from suffering. Like they think, and that's, when they suffer, it then becomes a great challenge to their faith. Well, that's a really odd conception, particularly when you have a savior who was crucified. God doesn't protect Jesus from suffering. He doesn't protect us from suffering. It's what we do with our suffering, how we manage that, because it is an assault on us and it affects our spirit. And it's a challenge to our spirit to continue to be generous, continue to be loving, continue to be creative in this context where it becomes difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. And I think there's a very direct connection between this last point and the previous one, although it might not be very obvious, but the connection is there from my viewpoint. And it has to do with a transformation of suffering. And I think this is somehow our mandate, at least in the light of the crucified Lord.
Yeah.
Our mandate is to make sense of it, and instead of hiding from the truth or simply being rebellious, why this, why me, and so on and so forth. It's a matter of considering the topic of suffering, whatever form, considering it from a variety of viewpoints seriously and trying to transform it again or convert it again. And if I may add some mystical nuance to it, I think you mentioned earlier that suffering and death and the end are natural, and they are natural. They have nothing to do with the so-called original sin or ancestral sin or something. That's how the universe is built. It has a beginning of its existence. This is the logic of the early Christians. Whatever has a beginning of its existence should end. And perhaps this is easier to grapple with than the topic of suffering. And this is where I turn to one of my favorite topics, which I don't have where to discuss and with whom to address it in all seriousness. There's a line in the book of Revelation, chapter 13 or something. I keep, look, I'm really funny. I keep forgetting. Is it 13:8 or 8:13? One. No, the book of Revelation, anyway. And and it's a verse there that can be read in a number of ways. But the way I read it, it sounds something like this: the Lamb of God that was crucified from the establishment of the cosmos, the establishment of the universe. It can be read in different other ways, but I prefer this reading. Why? Because somehow it explains why there is room for suffering, a natural place for suffering within our world, because the foundational paradigm, the foundational pattern of the universe is actually the crucified Lamb. As you mentioned crucifixion, I think what we have in history 2,000 years ago on the cross is a return to that original foundational paradigm of the universe, and the creation is based also on an act of sacrifice. So-called kenosis of the Word of God and the Son of God begins somehow mystically from before all ages. I don't know if my reading is correct, but what does this reading teach me is that if the principle of all things is a suffering lamb crucified for the life of the world, we should look at the topic of suffering as serving a purpose. I don't know how we can connect any form of suffering, especially when it's inflicted by other people, with the topic of purposefulness. But at least that's where I'm moving. And it makes sense to me because it points to the idea of transforming suffering like a serious consideration.
Look, and one of the things I've tried to do is always think larger. Like, and they say, I think it was 600 million years ago, an asteroid hit our planet. Now, and the dinosaurs were largely wiped out, that made it possible for mammals to emerge. And our existence is predicated on this massive destructive force, which there was a whole lot of suffering involved in that for the dinosaurs, at least, and then I'd sort of focused in on the much smaller things that I think about my own life, and I know how fragile the connection is that led to me. For instance, and this is true perhaps of just about everyone in my generation, if it weren't for World War II, we wouldn't exist, because our parents had children at a time, and the timing of those children was really dependent on husbands being away or at war, or marriages delayed, marriages rushed into, all that sort of thing, which there's a whole history of both good and evil, of suffering and enjoyment, and which led to my existence. And without that, I wouldn't be here, because the only me that exists was conceived at a particular point, at a particular time in space and time. And it's, that uniqueness means that the whole thing that's before that, all the way back to Adam and beyond, has given rise to me and you and everyone, so that we inherit a whole history of suffering, but also a history of evil, that we carry something of the whole of human history within us, and have some sort of responsibility towards that. How we make our lives in the face of that whole history. Like my I've had parents who were parents of the era that they were born in. My father didn't have a lot to do with his kids. I hope I had more to do with my kids and now my own kids are fathers, and my sons are fathers, and I think they're much more involved with their kids than I was. There's something better emerging there. But it can go the other way, as you know. I mean, violent and destructive fathers can sow the seeds of dysfunction intergenerationally. And the sins of the father are visited on the sons and daughters for 7 generations, because evil diffuses just as good diffuses, evil diffuses, and we need to be able to heal that damage, not just condemn it or not condemn it at all, but to try and find ways to heal that and turn people around out of their own history of suffering and pain, and to make something good out of it. I've really experienced this in working with survivors of clerical sexual abuse. What you see is most inspiring is those survivors who are able to turn it into a creative process. Not all of them manage to be able to do that, but they can overcome it and then move beyond it into some sort of normality. But it's a difficult path of healing for people. So anyway, that's how we work in Providence. There's one of the theologians my go-to theologians, Robert Doru, talks about we are self-constituting through world constituting. We make ourselves through the world we make. And in the end, the only question is, who do I become in doing these things? Because that's all I take with me. That's all I take with me. I take who I am, who I have become through the life I've lived, and the good and evil that I've done. And there's need for forgiveness, and there's need for healing, and there's celebration of what can hopefully be a good life. And trusting in, again, to get back, trusting in God's providence. That in the end, God has the last word. God has the first word. God has the last word.
Perhaps not a word that comes to us, at least through all sorts of translations, in a way that assures us that we're right. Perhaps that word comes in ways that are supposed to, I don't know, stir further thinking within us, rather than to comfort us and pat us on the shoulder and say, you've done well, so keep going, do nothing. In other words, do nothing, because ultimately the victory is mine.
Well, I'm very mindful of the parable of the talents, What have you done with what you've been given?
So there is freedom, and you pointed out the fact that we have to become somehow masters of our own lives, as in acknowledging whatever is in our lives, and also trying to fix whatever is wrong in our lives, trying to change, trying to improve. You mentioned there's need for forgiveness and healing and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, I think this is an invitation for us to become fully aware of who we are, what we are, how we live.
Yeah.
Because most people in our society, at least, I think, they started to believe too much in a narrative or a lie, rather, that they have created about themselves. And from this viewpoint, they missed the mark, and they never have an opportunity to undertake forgiveness and healing and restoration and so on and so forth. So that's one thing, and that has to do with our freedom, the way we handle our freedom. Where does God's providence come in this picture? We know, and it's heroic to believe in the fact that we are free and therefore responsible for our lives. Where does God come in this picture? Because I'm afraid that most people live with another lie, that God will sort things out for them without somehow they having to process whatever God does.
Yeah. Look, as I said, for a lot of people, religion is a talisman to ward off evil. I remember years ago listening to a Radio National program, and it was interviewing a Baptist minister who had been a missionary, come back to Australia, set up a ministry in Tasmania, I think it was. And next thing, he was diagnosed with MS. And he said his first thought was, why me? Why has this happened to me? I've done I've done all the good things. And he thought about it for a while, and then he said, I thought, well, why not me? There's no, or I think it was Catherine of Siena who famously used to ride around going from monastery to monastery, clearing up, decadent religious practice. And she got knocked off a horse and she landed on the ground and said to God, well, if that's how you treat your friends, it's no wonder you've got so few of them, There are other things going on than just whether I'm suffering or not suffering, or that everything that's there, in a sense, as I say, I mean, apart from evil itself, there's a meaningfulness about it that we can work with, and yes. God doesn't protect us from suffering. Never has. I mean, you look at the whole of human history. When has God ever really prevented suffering for people, except in the odd sort of miraculous way? And but even when God, miraculously cures people, they still die in the end. We all die.
Lazarus was brought back to death.
Lazarus was brought back from the dead,
of years,
and then he died again, like he's not still kicking around. There's how do we embrace our creaturely status, which is finite, which is going to come across with all the difficulties. And I didn't quite like the word that we're masters. We're not masters, but we have to concede the reality of our own finitude. And that means that there are times when we will simply be out of control. Now, we can experience that being out of control fearfully, or we can try and just trust that God is working through this in some way. God's got God's eye not only on the little picture, but the big picture, and not only on the big picture, but on the little picture. When I used to teach, way back, one of my first sort of teaching jobs in a seminary, it was creation, course on creation. And the first thing I'd do would be to take them through the size of the universe and how unbelievably, unimaginably large the universe that we're talking about is. It still beggars the imagination when you think about it. And God creates all that. God holds all that, every aspect of it, in God's heart and mind and love and generosity and intelligence and providence. It's unbelievably, and at the same time loves each of us individually. Like, we're part of that. One of the things, the cosmology is making increasingly clear to us that all the chemicals in our body were the result of supernova explosions, that they were all cooked up in the heart of stars and then spewed out when the star exploded. all those exploding stars, without which we wouldn't exist. And again, one of the things I used to say in class, the universe had to be as big as it is and as old as it is for us to exist. And even if we are the only intelligent life form in the whole universe, which is a massively big place, it would still have to be as big as it is and as old as it is for us to exist. That's how the universe is unfolded. It wasn't sort of popped into existence or fully formed. It's this enormously long, slow process of accumulation of the necessary materials. And here we are, the products of 13 billion years of cosmic evolution.
Which is a history of death and transformation.
The whole way. The death of stars to make us, the death of the species that came before us, that's part of what it is to, accept one's creaturely status in this just unbelievably massive. For most of us, our God is too small. We're still thinking in a sort of almost Galilean universe, ignorant of everything that is around us. Heaven is above, earth below, and maybe there are a few planets. And it's not, we also have to keep in mind that most of this just wasn't known till 100 years ago. People even 100 years ago had no real idea how massive the universe is or how old the universe is. Hubble would have been one of the first to sort of do the calculations to get some sense of the whole Big Bang thing. Before that, we had no idea, and there were physicists still pushing steady state theories of cosmology when I was at school. Very famous ones associated with Sydney Uni, Herman Bondi and Bondi Gould, and another person was still pushing. The science fiction writer who was also a physicist, Hoyle. They pushed a steady state theory. They were still pushing it in the 60s. We have only just culturally beginning to assimilate what it means to be creatures in this creation.
And you mean with all this discovery of immensity, of the vastness of the universe and its history, we are given an opportunity to contemplate a different facet of the divine providence.
Absolutely.
Because all that story, 13 plus, I don't know how many billion years, all that history of deaths and transformations and changes and movement and so on and so forth led to us.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's providence.
That's providence. It's work. That's providence.
So we don't need those, as you said, supernatural interventions to suspend the order of nature. You have nature well understood, teaching us about the divine providence. That made our presence here, even this conversation, possible.
Yeah. And if you were to wind the reel back and start it all out again and let the whole thing go, just the tiniest, smallest quantum variation in those initial conditions, and we wouldn't be here. So in a very real sense, God has made the universe in order for you to exist and me to exist. Because God has said yes to you, to me, to the world as it is, which is, unless there's a redemptive moment in that, then that's horrific. Unless there is something more than we can comprehend. I mean, we're all, very concerned about the pandemic, and rightly so. The Black Death killed a third of the population of Europe in the 14th century. It was apocalyptic. We're going to face even far greater challenges with climate change in the next 10, 20 years or so. The pandemic will be looked back as a golden age, because there will be massive social dislocation. There will be infrastructure will start to decay, and we won't be able to afford to fix it. There will be conflict between nations over water resources and food, and because it's going to get really awful. And in a very real sense, this is the working out of sin in human history. We knew about this. We could to stop it, to stop us from acting. So there.
Okay, so technical problem sorted. Let's see if we can return to the topic. So you were talking, Neil, about the next very grim decades, couple of decades, perhaps a bit more, hopefully, and the failure of the infrastructure. And you just pointed out before the technical issue occurred, the fact that we should consider this from the viewpoint of human sinfulness, because we had to become more receptive to the signs that were given to us, and we haven't, isn't it?
Look, as the story goes, ExxonMobil in the 80s, 70s and 80s, they started to hear about this climate change issue. They got their own scientists to work on it. Their scientists said, yep, this is a problem. And Exxon said, the solution to the problem is lies and deception. And that was the fossil fuel industry across the board. And that was sinful. That was just deeply sinful. It put self-interest over the interest of the planet as a whole, of all of humanity and the rest of creation. And people, we will be paying the price for that for some time. So there is the outworking, and I think there is a providence in this, that there are no sins without consequences in that sense. And when we look at one of the things I often sort of contemplate is what we think we mean when we talk about the end of the world, the whole eschatological apocalyptic sort of thing. And again, most of us still live in a almost Copernican universe when we think of that. But we cannot mean that the whole universe is going to end when humanity dies, whenever that might be, because that's just not going to happen. The universe will just keep on chugging along. So what do we mean when we make theological statements about the end of the world? And what we probably mean, I think, is just the end of human history. That end is a judgment. It is a judgment on us all. It's a judgment on human history as a whole. We look back and what could have been that wasn't. What could have been in human history that we've simply failed to take the opportunity. And So there is a judgment on us all that will work itself out through the consequences, what used to be called the suffering of punishment. Yes, there is a suffering to go on because we have failed. We have failed as a species. So the scripture scholars always have they have some different opinions about, the Our Father, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And one of the common translations now for that is save us from the time of trial. Well, we are about to undergo a time of trial as a planet for our failures.
So the judgment comes, and we will give account for our choices, for what we did to ourselves and others and the whole world. But in what way does providence prevail in this case? So we are clearly, and I fully agree with you, we are a failed species. There's so much meanness. What we do to one another is unbelievable, irrational. You said earlier, irrational. It has no sense whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense. Okay, so that's already a failure. And even we Christians, the terrible spectacle of disunity among Christians. That's the clearest failure in terms of the gospel, that is a power supposed to bring us together, not to divide us. We all of us failed. How do we still, or can we still, proclaim the divine providence as victorious?
Because the divine providence isn't a guarantor that everything will turn out nice.
That's a fair point. A very subtle nuance.
It's just that
brings more bad news to people and their confidence.
The crucifixion is in that providence. Jesus died. He rose again. So God had the last word, and God does have the last word. And, we do have confidence in God's graciousness and mercy. But there's also got to be a clear acknowledgement that we have failed in so many ways. We've failed one another. We've failed future generations. We have carried forward not just the grace of the past, but also the sin of the past. We could get started talking about original sin, but that's for another time. There is no guarantee that we won't just sort of work ourselves into extinction. There is no guarantee. It's in fact the more likely scenario, given the propensity of human sinfulness and the way in which individual people's decisions can have huge outcomes. I think there's no necessary happy ending apart from our trust in the fact that this is the creation that God has chosen. This is not, none of it's going to come as a surprise to God. On the other hand, God thought it worth the effort. God thought it worth the effort to do. God thought it was good. God saw it all and it was good. And that goodness will triumph, but not necessarily in the way we hope.
And so our trust, because many of us trust the sciences, I do. So you got the vaccine. I got the vaccine, and so on and so forth. Many others. That's just an example. But
Yeah.
we trust the sciences, and this trust somehow has given us an idea that we will prevail. In other words, we will not get extinct. And regardless of the vicissitudes of history and geography and the climate and all that, we'll find a way. Is this hopeful thinking?
Yeah, it's optimistic thinking. It's got a certain naivety about it. There's just one line in Lonergan's method in theology. Of course, Bernard Lonergan is my other go-to theologian, where he just says, a civilization in decline digs its own grave with relentless consistency.
Oh, beautiful. So beautiful.
Digs its
And
own grave.
unfortunately, we don't even die purposefully or for a purpose, for a high purpose, the way the dinosaurs did, you know. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin had a beautiful line in his Human Phenomenon in the book, that every progress, every development, or any development requires a corresponding sacrifice or loss.
Yeah.
That tantum quantum, you know, principle of proportionality. So you want a good outcome, you need to put an equally valuable loss, sacrifice. So the dinosaurs died so that we can thrive or emerge and thrive. The question is, we do it to ourselves, you know?
So,
and what's the purpose? What
will emerge?
What's cost us?
Well, you know, we in the end we believe in the resurrection, you know, but the resurrection comes after death, not before it.
No, we still have to pay that price. Not knowing if our price will serve others or not.
Yeah.
But there's hope. At least we Christians have a hope.
We have hope. We have hope, but our hope is in God. And God also gives us science and technology, and that's, you know, that's part of it. But in the end, that can fail too. But God cannot fail. God's providence is efficacious.
And do you see any possibility, at least in theory, that we wake up, say, perhaps not next year? I hope personally, I hope that the pandemic would be a wake-up call for us, politically, socially, economically. It doesn't. So the way the governments seem to be managing the whole pandemic situation is something like, well, we have to suspend for a while our by default operation, but we tend to return to it to normality slowly. And poor ants like whatever, us and others, whatever, we just hope that day will come, you know. Now it's the second half of October when Freedom Day, whatever that is. Okay, freedom to go back to hospitals and all that, graveyards and all that. Okay, but let's say we learn something, maybe next year or the year after, we learn a lesson, and we know that there's a providence in place. Do you believe in the capacity of humankind as it is today? So I'm asking you to hypothesize personally, or to share something of your personal hope or lack of it. Do you believe that there is any chance left for us humans to wake up one day and say, well, let's turn all our tools, instruments, and means and whatever and power that we might have accumulated so far to work together with God towards a better outcome?
Yeah. Look, I personally, I doubt it. In a sense, we're already seeing the way in which we handle the pandemic is duplicating the way in which we handle everything else. That is, the rich are privileged and the poor suffer. We're prioritizing them, okay, I got vaccinated. There are several billion people in the world who simply have no access to vaccines. And that's a serious issue. What I do know is that we simply cannot predict what might come out of this. Just as generally everyone in my generation was born because of World War II. Who will be born now because of COVID? Who would not have been born? COVID has already had. I'm pretty sure Donald Trump would have been re-elected if not for the COVID crisis. So it's not all bad. That this was a malignant narcissist running a country. I think we would have seen in another 4 years the complete sort of authoritarian emergence there, and he would have tried to have himself installed for life. He's a wicked man, and without COVID, he probably could have got away with it. So it's not as if there are no good outcomes we can't already see. But there will be people who are born now who will have been born because the COVID outbreak occurred. What might they do? We don't know. Will this be a significantly different generation? Will there be people who emerge precisely because of this? My grandchildren's life experience is radically different from what we would have expected, what we experienced. They're living through something. How will this shape their experience of life, their senses of responsibility? So there are a whole lot of unknowns there, and we just have to wait and see. What we do know is that it's unpredictable and there are no guarantees. It is what people will make of it. We don't have a good track record. That's clear. On the other hand, the Cuban Missile Crisis, we were within hours of all-out nuclear war, which would have destroyed tens, hundreds of millions of people in a matter of 2 or 3 hours, and millions more from radiation over the next 20, 30 years. And it was avoided. By the grace of God, it was avoided. And we just sort of slowly crept back from that nuclear precipice. It's still sort of there, but we've realized that this is just a step we don't want to take. The COVID thing is another test in that sense, but the climate change thing is the big test. It's the frog in the slowly heating up water.
Yep.
It's the frog in where, oh no, we're okay, until it's too late. So that's the test at present. And as I say, we don't know what COVID might do to us. It's given us some breathing space. This is another good thing out of COVID. The shutdown of international travel, the restrictions on travel generally has given us a bit of breathing space on the climate issue. Maybe turn the clock back a year or two to give us more time. simply because economy shut down, transport shut down. The air in Sydney is actually really good at present.
True.
Because cars are not being used and so on. So, we do trust in God's providence, but not to solve the problem, but to help us through the problem and to face the consequences of our action.
Thank you very much. Professor Neil Ormerod, always a pleasure, Neil.
Yeah, you're welcome, Doru.
It's amazing. I would not want to end this conversation without making a brief announcement that Neil will be giving soon a paper on providence to conclude the seminar series of the SCD's Theology Research Network. And I invite our viewers to stay tuned and actually seek the website Theology Research Network. I'll provide the link.
Yep.
And hopefully they'll register for your talk. Thank you very much, Neil. It has been such a pleasure and an honor.
Pleasure. Enjoy it.